Hello and welcome to The Dialogue. I have been watching a video called What If Science Took the Paranormal Seriously? The Superhumanities, Professor Jeffrey Kripal, PhD. And it's on a podcast called Essentia Foundation. I'm not sure who the host is. I've never watched one of these episodes before. But it's good timing because I'm feeling like my energy is starting to come back, my curiosity. And so usually what happens for me is whatever energy level I'm at, that's the type of content I'll find on YouTube and I'll find interesting. And this video in particular is really helpful to get back on track with exploring the human potential aspects of so-called bipolar and mania. And as it often happens, well, pretty much all the time, when I'm watching content about the human potential movement, they're not referring to people who get diagnosed with mental illnesses per se, though sometimes they allude to it. And he does, I think, one time in this video. But he's talking about how some of these non-ordinary experience, they're not just like subjectively real, but they're objectively real. And he's talking about so many other things, and he wrote a book called The Superhumanities, which I just heard about, so I haven't read. But it really resonates and extrapolates to my experience of basically, for periods of time, experiencing my own superhumanity. And for me, it's self-evident. Like, I was obviously partly the superhuman version of myself for a period of time. And in this particular podcast, Professor Jeffrey Kripal says that the superhumanity part of each person, which we all have, might be only 1%. But if somebody accesses that 1%, then it becomes the most meaningful part of one's life. And that's definitely true for what has happened to me, like things that I experienced back in 2011 and in subsequent iterations of so-called mania or, superhumania, still hold a lot of meaning in my life to this day. And that meaning just gets built upon with each iteration. And the superhumanity aspect of ourself, it's outside the societal framework. And it also helped me realize, too, that, one of the reasons why I find myself quite disconnected from society is because even though my superhumanity might be only 1% of my life's experience in total, it still kind of occupies a lot more of my space, whereas that's sort of my meaning and value framework, even though I'm not in a superhuman state all the time. But those aren't the value frameworks that are the ones that play out in society. For example, we don't tend to walk around and talk to strangers or friends or family about our synchronicity experiences to the point where they might share some of theirs, and then that might create a synchronicity experience, for example. There's so many ways that can come about. So I wrote down a few notes while watching this and just wanting to talk about it more so in real time than accumulating notes as I've tended to do over the last few years. So I thought to myself, rather than message him and say, is mania part of superhumanities? Is the extraordinary experiences of people who get called mentally ill part of superhumanities? Etc. And just like at times I've declared, some of these experiences are part of the human potential movement, so is mania is part of the superhumanities. It's pretty obvious to me. And I know that for myself. It's part of getting connected to the superhuman part of me. It's more energy, which allows me to do that. Now, there's a trade-off in that I think that by going so far into it sometimes, it takes away from some of the other parts that before I had energy for. But it also makes sense in terms of a change of values, like when you experience that superhumanity and how life unfolds when embodying that, then the old social structure becomes pretty meaningless. And so you can think, well, a person isn't motivated or they're non-functional, but that level of functioning just seems very trivial. So it's there, that's a trade-off, right? Because it makes it harder to live in the world that we all share most of the time, especially because the superhumanity embodied part isn't happening all the time. And that's why I've created Reuncovery, in order to bring some of the superhuman stuff into daily life. And now a very simple example of that is if I have an insight or a revelation that comes from that state of superhumanity, I write it down. Now, say 1 month later, I'm no longer in that state of superhumanity, and I look at that piece of paper. Well, I have an artifact of being in that state, and now I'm no longer in that state. I'm in my regular human state, which I call cis consciousness, and I'm looking at something from my trans conscious state, and now I brought it into my daily life. And so if I'm looking at it from a regular state, what I wrote in a heightened state, that's like, for example, I'm not comparing what I write to, say, a religious text, but say I'm reading a religious text. That information came from like a religious state of consciousness and religious experiences, and I'm reading it in my regular state of consciousness. Well, when I'm in my own heightened state of consciousness and I have my own, religious and mystical insights, or just contextual, it can be contextual, it doesn't have to be anything that special. And then I look at it in a regular state of mind, like that's going to have an effect. That's like being able to retrospect on it, but it's actually future-specting. It's not really retrospecting, because that heightened state of consciousness, it's not really heightened. It's an energy, a higher energy level, which is associated with a future consciousness that we can evolve into. So the superhumanity has information to give us about where we're going as a humanity, what's possible. Well, it is possible, because if we're able to embody that even 1% of our life, it's possible. So can we embody it for 2% of our life? Or can somebody who goes into a non-volitional extraordinary state like mania, through Reuncovery or whatever process they use of iteratively learning to embody that, can they be in that superhuman state of consciousness and embodiment 50% of the time or 10% of the time, and pass some of that on to other people? Because even though we might have that as 1% of our being, some people would have it more, and some people maybe never will access that in their whole life, which they could now because psychedelics are widely available, but a lot of people will choose not to, or just won't resonate, or it's not something that will come up, and that's fine too. But I'm thinking that some people can likely embody more of a percentage of it. And that's up to each one to sense. So that being said, rather than me like proving it to an academic, which I generally don't do, there's also trying to sort of share it and prove it with people who go into mania, right? Because if we're told, well, we're mentally ill, we're defective, all those experiences we had in mania and psychosis aren't signs of quantum consciousness or human potential or superhumanity. No, they're just signs of a mental illness. Well, I personally, for myself, do not think that's true. It's challenging. It can definitely subtract other areas of my life temporarily, but we're not this linear being. We're not this linear ego thing. We're not this Newtonian material thing that just accumulates a small amount of learning over time. And that's something that I'm learning to disconnect from a bit more lately, is linearity, like the clock, time, what should I be doing at this time, when should I be waking up, blah, blah. It's like, who says, right? And more leaning into non-linearity and going with that. So it's 1% of the time maybe, but like I said, it's probably more than that. Like for myself, I have access to my superhumanity, or what my superhumanity has shown me to inform my humanity. So it's part of my humanity now. I don't have to be in my superhuman state in order to access the information that I would be able to get before, only in the superhumanity state, my superhuman state. So for me, it's definitely more than 1% of the time, and definitely in the last month or so, I haven't had access to like any of it, barely. And that's fine. That's part of it. That's part of the non-linearity. That's the trade-off. Like for a month, like I feel no urge to be social. I feel like not much, not that curious, not learning. But then I'll go on a long period of being able to learn in a very deep and profound way for myself. Like that's something I feel subjectively. And that is super important to me. And I'd rather have a month or so of like kind of downtime, rest time, and then the other 8 or 9 months be like super curious and have a very strong sense of meaning than have none of that, which I hadn't had before all this started, and just be kind of like even all the time. That wouldn't be fun. So for me, studying my mania is like studying my superhumanity. And I know a lot of time, and pretty much all the time, society, the system, advocates of like bipolar that help people say mania is dangerous. And it is, and it can be. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to teach us. That doesn't mean that, like, if I had a state of mania that lasted a week and I did some good things happen, some not so great, blah, blah, I'm not going to injure myself by going into a deep philosophical and metaphysical and self-dialogue process about it. It's going to help me understand what it shared for me to learn. Because if something not so good happened, I can learn from it. If something good happened, I can learn from it. If it's something meaningful or synchronistic, or if it had messages for me, or if it has a ways of showing me potentials that I have that I can bring into my life, like writing and making up words and understanding and learning, well, I want to glean those, because if I don't, then next time it happens is just going to try to teach me the same lesson. And then if I do, next time it happens, I'm going to be better able to learn. So I'm going to learn different lessons, more lessons, and it's going to lessen the intensity of being able to learn. So this whole process of re-uncovery is not about resisting it, but it's about being smart with it as well. Because, for example, in the re-uncovery framework, if I start to have an experience of mania or heightened energy, I actually don't want to go out and about and be too social with it, because it's going to be misinterpreted. That would be like saying, oh, I should take a psychedelic and then go walk down the busy street in my city. Like, that's not a good idea. It's the same psychedelic experience, but it's Gaia-delic. So it needs to be treated with the same respect. And, unfortunately, in the mental health space, there's not many people who will sit with you while you're going through a Gaia-delic experience. But of course, with the re-engagement with psychedelics, there's plenty of people now, oh, we'll sit with you while you're in a psychedelic experience. Well, generally those are short-lived, so that is understandable. And that just means if we want to be with our experiences during and after, we need to find ways to do that. And we can. Just as he said, our superhumanity might be 1% of our experience. And say for someone like me who goes into hypermania, say it is just 1% of my experience. That 1% still has way more learning, because it's my own experience. It's like my own real experience. It's objectively happening for me. It has more information to tell me and that I can learn from than an entire university degree, especially when taken over a lifetime and approached with the perspective of being able to learn from it. So yes, it needs to be approached carefully. It needs to be experienced carefully, way more carefully than we experience it now. If society says, oh, if you start to feel this way, it's a mental illness, that's the way it's held. Whereas if society said if you start having a Gaia-delic experience, you need to get into like a safe sanctuary, or, stay home and, make your home all spiritual, so then you feel that sense of sacredness, so you can really explore what's happening and the content and context of that and the metaphysics of it. But that's not how it's approached. We get this extra energy, and when we have extra energy, we think, oh, that's for pleasure and entertainment and enjoying ourselves. But if we really had extra energy, it's to transform ourselves, to metamorphose. You know, like, how much energy does it take for a caterpillar to metamorphose? A lot. And so we don't treat it that way because we don't have that model of understanding that we can have a psychedelic, mystical experience that's Gaia-delic, that doesn't need any kind of input consciously from the human. You know, they say consciousness, like consciously we process like 60 bits of information per second, and subconsciously it's like 11 million. You can think of that subconscious information as part of humanity as well as Gaia, because it's part of the calculations of moving around on the earth and Gaia. And it can at some point calculate, hey, I need to have a Gaia-delic experience, and dismiss or dismantle temporarily the 60 bits per second of conscious experience in order to have this Gaia-delic experience. It's so obvious that it's possible and likely in a lot of different scenarios, yet it's dismissed, and it has to be coming from people like us. That the thing is that we don't even need to convince people about this, because it's something that we can do while still subjected to the framework that we are subjected to, but we do it like this type of training and this type of inquiry into ourselves privately. And we do it privately because we're not going to sit there and talk this way with, say, a clinician for 10 hours a week. Like, they don't have time, we don't have money, the system doesn't have money for that. So we have to do it this way if we want to do it at all. Like, what else are we going to do? And you don't have to if you don't want to either. But to be given the option, at least, to like study mania like it is studying our superhumanity. And just because it's intense and potentially dangerous doesn't have to be in the long run. Like, mania eventually can be just as dangerous as psychedelics. Like, sometimes people have a really bad trip. But not all that, it's not the rule. Generally, it's not feared. Like, when people think of mania, they're like, the society is like, no. Whereas now society sees that people can have psychedelic experiences, and normally it's good, right? And then when society's perception changes, if somebody noticed somebody was having a Gaia-delic experience, they would help them get home and stay safe rather than what's happening now. So there's lots of things that can happen instead. And can I be part of the Superhumanities? No, I am part of the Superhumanities. I am part of the Human Potential Movement. I don't need to really ask permission. And the point of connecting mania and bipolar and whatever else follows with human potential, or part of growth and change and whatever happens, is because if we just keep calling it mania, then we're not really going to get anywhere. And also, Professor Kripal mentions that some of the people he interviewed for the book saw superhuman species, or like the new superhumans and things like that. Or maybe it was something he read by Nietzsche or something. And I wrote in my book that I saw the superhumans. Like, I did see them. They're very beautiful, and I wrote about it in my book. So like those things where he's like, he's looking to Nietzsche that said this, and Nietzsche's like long gone. There are people who are seeing the superhumans now. But people who have seen them get locked up and called mentally ill. So I think a lot of these people who are open to this superhumanity in general, then they want to like get the humanities of academia to like recognize that. They might be better disposing of their energy by starting to support people who are making these claims and called mentally ill. Because if some percentage of the people, say between 1% and 5% who get diagnosed, say, with bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever, if they are the 1% that actually are experiencing more of their superhumanity, and they can bring some of that superhumanity into their daily life, as well as bring some of that superhumanity to others, that's going to have a more huge effect than just like changing a few lines in an academic textbook, because that's the experiential people. That's like trying to get them to change the Bible, which never going to happen, and like arguing over what should be in the Bible, to talking about to the people who are having the non-volitional religious experiences now and asking them good questions, on podcasts and stuff. And, but that's, that's outside my circle of influence. Like, my circle of influence really is mainly just myself and my self-inquiry. And that's why I'm getting back into it. So yeah, they institutionalize religion and the concepts, and then they institutionalize people having religious experience. And that's just a general statement. I'm not saying like that's true for everyone, but it seems to be something that's happening. And he at one point said that he was talking about Nietzsche and how Nietzsche said God is dead, and then that was what he was trying to say, was that God is dead and we need to be superhumans. Like, God, our concepts of God are limiting us. And this is something I hadn't heard before. And Professor Kripal was saying that if you read Nietzsche in general, that's not what he's saying. He's saying so many other things about like strange experiences and this and that, and becoming superhuman. So he's saying that Nietzsche was saying things more outrageous than religion, or more outrageous than God is dead, that God needs to die for us to step into our superhumanity. And so, I'm thinking to myself, like, think about all the outrageous things that come through in mania, right? And if they're more outrageous than what religion says and beyond, then maybe that's superhumanity speaking, right? And he also talked about thinking impossibly. Like, his thing is about thinking impossibly. It's like, well, this is thinking impossibly. Mania is thinking impossibly, right? So like, so many of these statements, I could be like, that's what it's like in mania. Oh, you're saying superhumanity, we each have that 1% of the time, or it's 1% of us that we may or may not experience, or however he phrased it, that's mania. Like, how much of a person's life do they spend in that? And that's superhumanity. But what was interesting to me was he was saying how, and I don't know anything about history, but he was saying Nietzsche's sister sold Nietzsche's ideas to, say, the Germans, and that was part in what played a role, those ideas played a role in Nazism, like, oh, we're the superior people. And that kind of made me think about how no wonder society in general, like if somebody goes into mania or goes into their superhumanity, they call it grandiose, they call it all these things, and it could actually be a reaction to not wanting that type of thing to happen again, where, oh, this is the superior race or species or whatever. But the thing is that we all have this superhumanity, and by denying it in others, we are denying it in ourselves. Like, if somebody hasn't connected with that, right? So we're trying to bring people down, and then people who go into mania, they're called grandiose, and they're put on these pills to hopefully disconnect that person from their superhumanity forever. And apparently that type of thinking gets connected to like Marxism. Like, I don't know anything about these things. Not only do I not know anything, if I did know something, I can't remember. I'm just going to forget. So whatever I'm saying, I'm just trying to connect some dots here, and I know little about it, and even if I wanted to know something about it, I wouldn't be able to, because that's not how my brain works. So this whole thing about Marxism, which I don't really know, but I had an experience where it seemed like this group of people who were connected to like alternatives in mental health seemed kind of like connected to Marxism, which I don't know that much about. But from what the little I can glean in my mind is that, you know, it's about everyone's the same, nobody's special. Basically, it sounds like denying superhumanity. And for me, in my work, I think it's really important to go into superhumanity. So I can see that people within the movement, even if they are looking for alternatives to mental health, there's going to be a large percentage of people who are like maybe having this Marxist type of thinking and whatever that means, but basically thinking that we shouldn't explore our superhumanity. And I don't think that not exploring our superhumanity is going to help humanity. So this type of framework, re-uncovery, is about bringing one's superhumanity that one got connected with in a Gaia-delic experience called mania, iteratively keeps happening, because the superhumanity, once it comes knocking, is going to keep on knocking. It's not going to go away. It's a call from Gaia, from, you know, sure, I live in this apartment or whatever. This isn't where I live. I'm a being of Earth, and we all are. And that whole being of Earth can call us. Like, basically, all I am is this human on Earth with nothing. You know, how isn't that kind of Marxist? I don't know. Like, don't own stuff or have the same amount of stuff. I don't know what I'm talking about, so I don't want to talk about it too much. But basically, this re-uncovery framework is about bringing these things. So say I am a canary in the coal mine, and I'm trying to say these things, and then I get diagnosed mentally ill. And then I realize, well, nobody's listening to me, and now that I'm diagnosed, nobody's ever going to listen to me. What I can do is listen to myself and bring some of these superhuman things into my life, even creating myself into being able to write some of these insights and revelations I got in superhuman states into a book or into a blog post. That is something beyond what I would otherwise do had I never had access to that information through being in a superhuman state. So just that in itself is an example of harvesting the information from the superhuman state, practicing writing it down. It's probably very non-linear, and, you know, even just kind of writing it down and sharing it, or writing it down and talking about it with oneself, because since I'm a human on this earth and I'm in the Gaia sphere, Gaia can hear me. Yes, Gaia is listening to every other creature, not like listening like there's this one being, but it's a whole listening field and field of action, and there's so many other things happening at the same time. But doing that is better than nothing. And the more of us that do, that's going to change the quality of the listening field and the Gaia sphere. So, so I wrote down that the hate of mania seems to come from the possibility of fascism and all that happened. And, you know, that would be an example. It seems to me like now, that happened in the past, but now I'm going to pivot to another example here, where it seems like Professor Kripal is interested in UFOs, you know, and they're calling them something else now. I don't even know what, something. But it really struck me when he was saying that he liked the possibility of UFOs because, and I might be saying this wrong, because it's something that unites us. And I've thought of this before, and, you know, society has thought of this before, like back in the day with the film Independence Day. You know, we're all one humanity if UFOs start coming here, right? Because as he said, UFOs don't care about our borders and identities and nationalities and all of that. And so UFO, unidentified flying object. And it made me create a transmutation of that, which is something my brain often does. So unidentified flying object goes to non-identified internal subject, or you could call it eternal subject, whatever. And so, because I'm thinking about how that would unite us as well. When we have this non-identified subjectivity that's internal, that isn't ego-based, if we all have that, we have within our subjectivity the ability to identify, to, build our ego. But we have the ability to break it down, and Gaia has the ability to break it down for us, or dismantle it, or temporarily disengage it, right? And so we have this non-identified internal subject. So I think the way I was seeing that was like to think that we have to wait for aliens to come here in order to unite us as a humanity. I think if we don't move towards the non-identified internal subject, we will have to wait for the aliens, and they will come. I actually had what I called a movie script scenario idea come from this, because I feel like the aliens are us. And this is something that Professor Kripal said, is like the aliens are us from the future, in a way, like a future whatever. And yeah, they will come to see us if we don't get this non-identified internal subject thing going. And if we do, the aliens won't need to come here, because in a way, some of this information that I get access to and other people get access to that comes from the outside, or, it gets channeled, it's from future human thought. And those thoughts are already there as sort of an iteration and extrapolation of today's current thoughts. And we can pick up on them. I think they're there. Like they're even there within the objects we have now. We can look at an object and have an insight into it, something new. But that's within the possibility space of perceiving the object. And so when you get in the possibility space of your non-identified internal subject, you can perceive the possible thoughts, and I don't even think they're thoughts, they're insights, which is a little bit different. It could be an insight when you have it new and fresh, and then it can become a thought when it starts to repeat, like it's an actual thing, like stored in the brain or wherever it goes. So when we're with that, then we can start perceiving that, because and then when we do, and we start sharing that with other humans in order to evolve into more superhumans that we go on that path. But if we don't connect with that, eventually those evolved humans will evolve to a place where they can come back in time and say something to us, or something happens, or whatever, right? It kind of makes sense. So it's all within us. And, do we have to be united through UFOs or UA, whatever they call them now? Or can we unite through superhumanities and quantum consciousness and quantum creativity? And like I mentioned, it might only be the 1%, but it becomes the most important, meaningful part. And I think when it does, and when we apply a meaningfulness framework to it, we can actually make it more than 1%. Not just 1% of our experience that we had, but having that inform us can make our daily life experience have more of that essence. And then it's actually more than 1% of our daily life. And yeah, so I'm trying to convince myself to stop convincing others. And I haven't really been convincing others per se, but there's this sense of wanting to be done with that and just be strong in like, yes, this is part of superhumanity. What does that mean moving forward? How does that inform my life? How do I gently invite more of this superhumanity into my life, and what's that going to do? And, can I find ways to interact with others based on superhumanity rather than, the current structure? And what does that look like? There's actually a YouTuber who I won't mention exactly because whatever, doesn't matter. But this YouTuber is very much, when she talks to people who aren't convinced of what she's saying, she says that they're actually part of the people that basically most people, almost nobody would be convinced of this, right? So if anyone who's not convinced of this, in quotes, tries to not convince me of this, they're just like, you can't talk to them. You're like, they're almost proving the point within itself. It's like, if you say your point is that most people are not going to understand this, then if somebody who is the most people who comes in and says this doesn't make sense, then there are, like, it just is saving brain capacity, that's all, and putting the energy where it can be utilized. Because the thing is, I do think, and even in common speak, it's like, we just need a critical mass of people to get this. And I think people who have these Gaia-delic experiences are part of the critical mass. But also, there can be people eventually who see somebody who has Gaia-delic experiences and says, hey, actually, I do want to learn from them. I do want to ask them questions based on their actual experiences, not according to some book or some philosophy, but the actual experiences, and also how those experiences has informed them in order to be a non-linear being, and not trying to make all this non-linear into this type of content that is palatable to the left brain, which is only going to confirm its own crap, right? It's not even going to work. So that's why I'm trying to move away from trying to fit this non-linear type of consciousness into just like linear structures. Like, here I'm talking about this, like, you either want to listen or you don't. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to tell you next. So you can already make up your mind about how you think about it, and then dismiss it and not even listen anyway. So, all these things they say. So anyway, like, focus on making more superhumans. And for me, creating re-uncovery, stage A is draft, stage B is craft, stage C is graft. Like, literally grafting on the learning that is first experiential and pragmatic in the experiences of mania, and then is more conceptual and thinking divergently and creatively through self-dialogue with it, in order to build like a meaning body, build a metaphysics, where that metaphysics literally changes my whole structure to naturally, like, program, in quotes, the embodiment, which is like pretty much kind of programming superhumanity into myself. And again, if I'm only able to embody my superhumanity 1% of the time, I'm still probably ahead of 98% of people, because even though all of us have this 1%, that, as it's explained, probably 98% of people never really experience it. And even people who experience it psychedelically, it might not be the same as Gaia-delically, because I think psychedelics is more into the mind, and Gaia-delic, most people do go out and wander in society, and you see how Gaia-delics does change how social interactions happen. It does change some of the laws of physics. It does activate synchronicity and cities, like spiritual powers and all this. And I said, once you see that this starts to happen in the second mania, it's smarter to stay home. So I'm not saying, oh, go out and play with these things, because it's dangerous. It's like, if you levitate in front of people, that's not going to be good. And if you're in front of people, it's less likely to happen. So I'm saying to treat it with intention and Like, it's really like if somebody goes to university, generally they're going to like put a lot of energy into it. Maybe they're paying for it. Maybe they're working at the same time in order to make it happen. Like, having these Gaia-delic experiences is like going to university. It's like going to Gaia University. And it needs to be taken seriously. Like, it's a serious area of study, like maybe the most serious, because it is so experiential. And like I said, when it's Gaia-delic, and like for me, I did in the first couple times go out and wander out in society, and magical things would happen. Like, that's not the same as laying on the floor with headphones on and a mask to block everything out and going into the mind. This is going into the mind of Gaia. So it is way more powerful. Hence, if somebody does psychedelics, you're not going to get carted off to the psych ward mostly. But if somebody has a Gaia-delic experience, it's often going to be interpreted as needing to lock that person away or like lock them away chemically for a long time. So, yeah. So I think, though, that for myself at least, I'm going to tell myself this. You must explore your superhumanities after you taste it. You must at least at some point figure out that you need to explore it. Otherwise, it's a disservice to yourself. It's a disservice to your potential and your possibility. It's a disservice to humanity. And so many of us say, oh, we have something to offer society, but we don't know how. And for me, that's where the re-uncovery framework comes in. And just like Professor Kripal said, he said, people who have these experiences, even psychedelic experiences, or other strange experiences, they're looking for a model of reality in which what happened is possible. So our current model of reality, like the materialistic, reductionistic model, says, well, that isn't possible. Now, if we've had an experience, a Gaia-delic experience, well, we know they're possible. They happened, right? And then we get reduced to being a mental patient, which is like saying, not only did that not happen, if it did happen, it was just mental illness, and don't even try to go there ever again. If you do, that's bad. That's your illness. That's lacking insight into your illness. All these things, right? Why are they trying to scare us so much from going into that? And I wrote down that having a model in which this is possible that it happened is actually easy. There's actually tons of them out there. What we don't have a framework for is something he mentioned, to connect the dots and to make these things more possible, right? Now, I would say to make these things more possible, it's not having the same experience again that's necessary, or even having these experiences, but being able to harvest and practice and embody some of these traits and behaviors into our daily life. And then that makes what the superhuman experience is trying to tell us more possible. Meaning learning and integrating the lessons of what we're supposed to know and figure out from these experiences. Like, think about how much we try to know and figure out by reading books or listening to podcasts. What about having an experience that is so out there, right? Like, when we read a book, we're reading something that maybe we've never thought of before. We've never looked at it that way. Well, when we have these Gaia-delic experiences, we're having literal embodied experience. Like, imagine putting on a VR headset for the first time. This is like putting on your actual superhuman self, that best character that you would ever design in the best game ever created with the best VR headset or chip in your brain. We already have that as our superhumanity. Now, rather than just thinking, how did that happen? It's like, what can I do with that? How can I be that? How is it that I was that? And why is it that I can't not stay that way? It's not about staying that way. Because trying to stay that way is the same as saying, well, I'm this, trying to just be superhuman is the same as being like, oh, I'm just this ego all the time. It's that state is a way to read the best book we've ever read, but about ourselves, but it's an actual experience lived. That's better than a book. That's better than a podcast. But we don't look at it that way. We don't look at it as, I just read the book of myself by grafting on to myself without my choice something that makes me superhuman. People become superhuman in a state of emergency where they see someone in trouble, like they'll do something heroic, right? But that's not necessary per se, because Gaia in the Gaia-delic experience can do the same thing to get us in touch with this. And it makes sense that some of us are being sort of iteratively trained to step into that. Now imagine if one day something happens to humanity where those traits of our superhumanity are needed, and the people who have tasted that and learned to harvest, practice, embody that are going to be the ones that are able to find a way out of this problem, this hypothetical problem, whatever it is, which could be the meta crises that we're experiencing now. Actually, we're going to need those people. We're going to need those people to integrate. So what's happening right now to people is not great. And mania is a catalyst, or Gaia is the catalyst of the energetic experience of mania. But with any reaction, there's substrates, and then there's products of that reaction. So the substrate could be the human brain and body, as well as the substrate of the environment and experience. And the energetic catalyst makes it so that the product of those two things is much different than it would be without that energy. The behaviors are different, the experience is different, the actions are different, which lead to different experiences through a momentum of many degrees of freedom of action. But at the same time, that energy is temporary. But we still have, after, when our brain and experiences go back to the usual state of affairs because of lack of that energetic catalyst of Gaia, then we have those products, we have those memories, or maybe even certain things that we created or captured in those experiences that are the artifacts of the state that showed that it had something to offer, even though after, it can take a while to even get back to a regular state of being able to operate after that energy wears out. And I do think that re-uncovery is a path to being superhuman. And I think that at some point re-uncovery just becomes quantum creativity. So I think in the state of mania we have this quantum creativity, which involves being creative with our actions and behaviors in our experiences, for better or for worse. And that's a way to reality test and figure out like what we can do going forward. But then when the energy is withdrawn, we can't even necessarily access those behaviors anymore, or those actions, or those perceptions. So then Professor Kripal said, we don't necessarily need more dots, we need a framework to connect the dots. And this is something that I am grappling with now, and maybe I always will be, because I have way more content flowing through me and channeled through me, and this non-ordinary information that isn't coming from my own brain. It's sensed as something new. I'm able to pick up on it and write it down. And this is why I like self-dialogue as part of the framework, because it is a way to connect the dots for myself. So if I have an insight or a revelation on a bunch of sticky notes, I can sit down and start talking about them. And generally, like even this time, I had a short pile of sticky notes, and then I would talk about most of it and connect those dots before looking at the sticky note. So those are there as sort of placeholders, but then I'm able to connect the dots by speaking about them. And I find that for me, that's a lot easier than writing. Even having all those sticky notes and being able to put them in a linear order and then write, it's somehow more difficult for me to do that. So, that's part of the framework to connect the dots that of re-uncovery that not necessarily everyone would want to do. Some people might be able to connect the dots better through writing, or connect the dots better through drawing, or through AI art, or ChatGPT. Who knows, right? ChatGPT can be the framework for connecting the dots, and not necessarily using a re-uncovery self-dialogue framework. I mean, self-dialogue. But I think it's important to keep our brains activated with our own voice. And I am using ChatGPT a little bit, but in moderation. So I think mania is a technology of Gaia. It's Gaia-delic. And re-uncovery is a technology of the self. It's a way to self-reflect, and it's a metamania. And I was listening to a little bit of my last dialogue, and I heard myself say that one of the challenging parts about re-uncovery, or wanting to share re-uncovery, is that I spend large periods of time like in a lower state where I'm not really that functional. So how does one share this aspect of human potential? But listening to this talk about how superhumanity really represents like 1% of ourselves, and I think, like I shared, I think people who go into these non-volitional extraordinary states, and people who probably do some psychedelic journeying with the intention to grow and learn, can embody more than 1%. But perhaps in most, there's this 1% superhumanity within oneself that is dormant. Now, I do think it can be made into more. But in learning that, yeah, this is actually just a very small part of ourselves. Like, if somebody works on helping people with diet, they're helping somebody with a large part of their life, like how much time they spend shopping and eating and cooking, and if it's also includes exercise, it's like a large percentage of every single day to make those changes. Whereas the superhumanity might be something that doesn't come online until late 20s or whenever. And then even still, it's something that doesn't get activated that often. So even though it's 1% and can be made larger than 1%, that kind of helped me put it into perspective. Like, it's this superhuman aspect that everyone has, even if they're successful or not. And if somebody is not successful in the eyes of society, accessing superhumanity, their version of it, may or may not make them successful. And it may also only be a small percent. But the thing is that once a person accesses that 1% or has a taste of it, I think, like it was said by Professor Kripal, that it can really not occupy 99% of one's consciousness, but within the sphere of what's meaningful or what's sensed as meaning, it can take up like 99% of that, to the point of where old life doesn't really seem meaningful at all. Yet at the same time, the superhuman state, which is just maybe 1% of time and space, it's only that. So like the rest of 99% of life can be sensed as meaningless in comparison. Yet by engaging with that meaning subjectively, contextually, all of life can be feeling meaningful because there's that meaning from the superhumanity. Now, with re-uncovery, those meanings can be brought into daily life, and I do feel the same essential ability and capacity to perceive and conceive of meaning subjectively through subjective alchemy can happen, and it doesn't need the excitement or energy for it to happen. The excitement and energy that connects us with superhumanity is to show us, with a small shift in perspective, we can really see anything is meaningful with these different values and this different approach to life. a meaningfulness approach. And even for myself saying that, I do generally have a meaningfulness approach to life, probably 80% of the time. So even though I might not be connected to my essential 1% superhumanity, which is like that reserve of energy that can get sparked through Gaia to do this sort of not fight or flight, but partly fight or flight, as well as connect to superhumanity, which is going to inform my life. So me, by doing that, I've been able to take that and use the way that my superhumanity looks at life to look at life a lot of times with that approach, even when I'm not in my, 100% superhuman state. So it still has largely influenced my life. And that would not have happened if I would have just been like, all my experiences were mental illness. So by engaging them, that has brought it into my life. Now, without that, that wouldn't happen, like I said. So this is really important for me to see that it's really this really small percent that we all have. And then there's a small percent of us in the world, like 1% to say 5% who get diagnosed, say bipolar, for example, which to me is more a Gaia-delic experience. And I've thought about it thousands of ways. That's not the only way or mechanism of possible awakening to that storage of energy. And, but I feel that by working with this 1% possibility, 1% in terms of maybe space-time, with the 1% of people who get diagnosed with the bipolar, which to me is Gaia-delic, non-volitional. Now, maybe only 1% of people who are bipolar or have that type of consciousness are interested in exploring re-uncovery. But now that 1% takes up 99% of the meaning, and that 99% of the meaning is like meaning space, the space in our consciousness. And then by increasing the amount of time, this is where re-uncovery comes in, by increasing the amount of time that we spend engaging with it through re-uncovery, we are going to increase the 1%. So that's what's going to change this, sort of everyone has this dormant 1% superhumanity to, by activating it and learning from it, because it's not linear and it's so rich, it's like it's a seed, like a seed in soil can create a whole tree. So this can create our whole superhuman being if we grow with that seed of light and revelation that we got access to. So because generally we're told like it's all illness, so we don't engage with a learning process of retrospecting and re-uncovering, then so we don't increase the time we're engaging with it in order to draft and craft our consciousness, and so it just remains this 1% superhumanity that is unengaged, but in cycles of quote mania, which is a Gaia-delic activation of getting in contact with that, it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. Like once that superhumanity is tried to engage with us as a seed to like grow alongside us in this next evolution of growth of a human, it's going to keep calling, and of course we're given things to hopefully stop that, but it doesn't stop. And we don't learn, and the longer we go without learning from it, perhaps the more challenging it gets, mainly because we've had so many different experiences, but and spent so much time resisting it without learning that we've built like a real maybe barrier in our brain, but that might not be true either. So like I said, at some point I think re-uncovery turns just to quantum creativity, where it's not necessarily about engaging with the experiences in order to learn, like catching up with engaging with the experiences that already happened in order to learn and engage with the experiences in real time as they happen in further iterations of Gaia-delic mania. And then also being able to learn in real time as they start to happen again. And then of course we can't learn everything, so re-uncovering as well. But at a certain point there's not very much re-uncovery, and that is when we're more in a dimension of quantum creativity. And then we're able to embody that seed that is that superhumanity within us is quantum creativity. But it's too much and it's too foreign to us for us to really embody it and go with it in a linear type way. But as we re-uncover, we eventually tip over from re-uncovering and catching up with the learning to learning in real time, like really learning in real time, to the point where life becomes like re-gamified, where we're this quantum being in a quantum world. And, you know, I'm not there yet, but I've been there, and that's why I can say it. I just can't stay there. And the other thing, couple last things, is that the Professor Kripal talked about people getting to altered states of consciousness in the past through aesthetic practices. I don't know how to say that word very well, but I realized that mania is sort of like an asceticism of the default mode network. So the Gaia-delic process, non-volitionally, without our choice, spontaneously makes our automatic programming gone, right? People can do that by, say, like fasting or like living up in a cave or something, but the Gaia-delic process essentially puts the ego in a cave. It's still there to some extent, and I'm going to talk about some of the things I sense are kind of why, and it has to do with the capacities of the right and left brain. So to me, the Gaia-delic experience puts us more in the processing of the right brain. But the thing is that our consciousness, our conscious experience, as well as our verbal experience, comes through the left. So even if we have all these profound right brain experiences in the Gaia-delic mania, it still gets all kind of garbled with noise from the ego, trying its best to get its word in somehow. But the energy is so great that the energy is a higher energy that kind of usurps the low energy state of the ego consciousness, but some still gets in there because it still includes all the lower states of energy, and it's up to us through learning and seeing what those lower states of energy are doing to be able to prune them out. And by having a higher energy consciousness, we can see what the higher energy consciousness is doing, what we're doing. And when the lower stuff gets in, from that higher perspective, we're better able to see what the lower is doing and meant to be like, yeah, no thanks. And it's easy to fall in the trap that there's this lower energy saying to do these things and then do them. Well, that's a mistake. You know, first, do no harm, for sure. So the last thing is that, I had this sense when I wanted to contact him to share my extasography stories. And because when he was doing research, was like getting stories from people who were saying these things happen, these things that defy the laws of physics. And he was saying he believed them, that they actually objectively happened. And some of my extasography stories, like, not only I have the photo, I have the video that it happened. So there are proofs out there. And if people knew that they could collect these proofs, rather than just being like afraid or thinking it's just nuts. Like, imagine how many times people have a cool experience and they think, oh, I'm going crazy, and they step away from it instead of just taking a picture and seeing if it's actually there. You know, there could be a lot more cool stuff out there to the point where we could show, but nobody really wants to know that, right? They want to feel really safe in this material kind of framework. So yeah, I just found it interesting about what he was saying also about integrating versus, and he said, you know, people don't want to integrate, or integration makes you boring. And I've never really thought of re-uncovery as integration per se, because no, for me, re-uncovery is about becoming superhuman, not just integrating and going back to old ways. And integrating doesn't necessarily mean going back to old ways, but it's almost like maybe getting a bit balanced with it, where, you know, with the way the world is going, or even if for myself, like being diagnosed as a mental patient, the trajectory of that, just getting that label and those treatments and everything is pretty sad. So if I'm just going to like take little bits and integrate versus really lean into that 1% superhuman, and that's what re-uncovery does. It's it's not even a model of reality in which it says what way this is possible, even though that's part of it, because chapter 3 of stage A is the 6 dimensions and 9 lattices, which can include learning topics that are in science or metaphysics or human potential that have points that are scientific or whatever that extrapolate very well exactly to the experiences we have. And that's a way to bridge the brain cells and bridge one's consciousness to, rather than just being, oh, that was illness, that was illness, that was illness, ignore, 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 to actually science says this is possible and this is possible, and mapping experiences to each point that proves it. Because the thing with science is it's so disjointed a lot of times from actual reality, even though it's saying to be describing actual reality. And a lot of what it's discovering, they don't really have examples of yet, but they do. They're just not listening to people who are describing these experiences, because those people are all like thrown an award, and other people too. So that's why for me it's more about having a dialogue with oneself and going with it that way. And yeah, I think that's all I want to talk about with this today. And it feels good to have a dialogue about something in real time. This is probably the first time I've done that in quite a long time. And hopefully I don't forget to keep going like that.